As I said a couple minutes ago, tonight we're going to talk about a heroic Irish priest and military chaplain who died a martyr of charity in Belgium during World War I. His story was brought to life in EWTN's original docudrama, Bravery Under Fire, Father Willie Doyle, S.J. And you can see that on EWTN Sunday, November 11th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Let's take a look at that, a little clip from that video.
Wait till there's madness about there.
He may not be alive tonight.
He went far beyond the call of duty. Nobody would have complained about it had he not.
No.
It's something that he felt he had to do. You know, the gospel says there's no greater love than to lay down your life for others, and that's a risk he was willing to take.
A priestly or a god warrior in some respects. He is with his men wherever they go, and because of that, the relationship that they have with him is one that they're so fond of him. They love him as he loves them.
So, joining us tonight to tell us more about the life and example of Father Willie Doyle is our guest, who is a contributor to the EWTN docudrama Bravery Under Fire. He's also a senior lecturer in the College of Business, in the Dublin Institute of Technology, and the editor of a new compilation of war letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of the Jesuit priest and World War I military chaplain, Father Willie Doyle. His book is called To Raise the Fallen. So please welcome Dr. Patrick Kenny. Good to have you.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's, I read the American version and wrote one of the endorsements at the back, and I found it a truly wonderful book. It's mostly, almost all Father Doyle's words. It's him telling his story and his experience as a chaplain in his diaries.
Yeah, and that's the very best way to learn about Father Doyle is to read his own words. I mean, he was an incredible writer, a very gripping writer. And in the history of the First World War, he's a very important figure because we have hundreds of thousands of words from him as an eyewitness of key events from the First World War. These letters were written home to his family, particularly to his father, and thankfully the family preserved them.
You know, it's important to understand a little bit. The movie, the docudrama, is going to be shown on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. It ended on November 11th at 11 a.m. in 1918. And now 100 years later, we'll be showing this docudrama on EWTN. It was a horrendous war. We oftentimes know too little because America got in it a couple years after the Europeans, after one of our ships was torpedoed by the Germans. And this war was fought over nationalism, which was an ideology from the French Revolution that put the state and sometimes the nation, but at this point it was putting the state and the empire ahead of God, ahead of the church, and ahead of individual lives. And there was a great carelessness by the military leaders don't seem to be that great, and there was a carelessness about human life.
Yes, certainly it seems in some ways life was cheap. You know, we have the phrase cannon fodder, and in a sense that's what a lot of soldiers turned out to be. But one of the great things about Father Doyle is he put others first, irrespective of where they were from. I mean, obviously he was a chaplain in the British Army and a Catholic chaplain, but he also helped a lot of non-Catholics and a lot of Protestants. But he also helped German soldiers who were wounded or who were prisoners. And he was renowned for his charity to everyone.
Yep, and that's that's why I mentioned what I said. While on one hand the governments were putting themselves ahead of people, someone like Father Doyle comes in and puts people only behind God himself. God was number one, and he's concerned with these folks. That's what makes him very distinctive in this massive killing. 25 million people died in the war.
And we know a lot about his motivations in terms of putting God first and also looking after the soldiers because of his own private diaries, not just the letters he wrote home to his family, but his own private notes that were never meant to be seen by anybody else. And he writes so eloquently about his desire to save souls, his desire to be there with the soldiers, his desire almost actually to suffer as well. And he was quite willing to be a martyr of charity. He knew going to war that he may not come back, and that was a sacrifice he was willing to take.
Now, when you talk about a martyr to charity, this is different than being a martyr to the faith.
Correct.
Martyr for the faith dies because you're a Christian, you're a Catholic. What do you mean by martyr of charity?
So a martyr of charity would be somebody who dies in the process of saving another. And in fact, it's a new category or a new pathway to canonization that Pope Francis opened up, I think it was last year or the year before. So great saints like Saint Maximilian Kolbe was canonized as a martyr, and there was some question, I think he was beatified as a confessor, but canonized as a martyr. There was a great round of applause when St. John Paul appeared wearing red at his canonization because the people realized he's been canonized as a martyr. But he wasn't necessarily killed for the faith. He was actually, Maximilian Kolbe was killed because he volunteered to step in instead of a father of a family who was going to be killed by the Nazis. So properly speaking, he's a martyr of charity. And that's exactly what Father Doyle was.
Right, right. And there are many other such people who have gone in to help plague victims and risk their lives for the sake of others in a variety of other ways, And any number of times we have first responders, firemen, policemen who save people from burning buildings. That's a martyrdom of charity.
Absolutely. I mean, another classic example would be St. Damien of Molokai, who died of leprosy because of his aid to lepers. But in the case of Father Doyle, it was a very conscious decision. You see that. And in fact, as a Jesuit student, he actually wrote a contract with Mary where he said, I wished to live and die as a Jesuit martyr, and I'll make this contract with Mary that I will deny myself throughout life if you grant me the grace of being a martyr and a Jesuit martyr.
So this is something that he made his decision. Now, also so folks understand, you are from Ireland and so is he, but the war wasn't particularly against Ireland. Why were the Irish involved in this?
Well, at the time, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. It was controlled by Britain. So many Irish soldiers went and fought in the British Army on the understanding that there would be some concessions in terms of home rule and so on if the Irish soldiers went and helped.
So they sort of promised freedom for Ireland if they helped in
Correct.
the war.
Yeah.
Because there already was a lot of tension about Irish independence.
That's right.
By that time,
yeah.
no?
And you see the 1916 Rising happening during that period of time when Irish soldiers were fighting for the British Army. And following the end of the First World War, there was the War of Independence and the Civil War in Ireland. So a very tense time in Ireland. And in fact, many of the Irish soldiers who fought in the First World War suffered greatly when they came back home because there wasn't necessarily a lot of understanding from the Irish about what they were doing fighting for Britain.
Yeah, why are you fighting for our enemy
Correct.
against their enemy?
Yeah.
So that there's a lot of tension, and sometimes a certain amount of nationalism within the Irish community that brought its own tensions. So Father Willie Doyle went with the troops to make sure that those who were Catholics received their Catholic ministrations, the sacraments and last rites and confession and so on.
Correct. Yeah, I mean what is the job of a chaplain? The job of a chaplain is to support the morale of the troops, but particularly to save their souls, to be there when they're dying, to give them the last rites, also to bury the dead, and also to write home to families to tell them that their son or their brother has been killed. So Father Doyle was busy doing all of that. We have very detailed letters of those experiences. So for instance, in terms of the soldiers and their faith, these men had tremendous faith, and he said he could often see a change in them once they'd received confession or been anointed. Soldiers who were hanging on for dear life, waiting for, they would literally call for little Father Doyle to come and help them. And he has testimony in his letters of soldiers who would say, "Oh, thank God you're here, I can die easily now."
Right.
Or other soldiers who, before going into battle, have confessed to him, and they go over the top out of the trench without any fear, and literally saying to him, "We're willing to face the devil himself now that we've had confession." So we see in these men a tremendous faith, and maybe it's living face to face with death brings that reality home to them.
Mm-hmm. And it's important, you mentioned this, but it's important to know that chaplains then and now do not carry weapons, that they are unarmed, much as medics are in the same position.
Yes.
That they're not there to harm anybody, but to help everybody. And so he was very vulnerable, being out there, which I think, can sometimes make you even more fearless. It can, drive away more fear that I'm not going to be looking to kill somebody. I'm seeking out this, and there's a certain amount of trust in his guardian angel throughout all this.
There is. I mean, Father Doyle, in fact, was not natively a brave person necessarily. His life is one of tremendous transformation, because as a young Jesuit student at about the age of 20, the building he was in went on fire, and he had what's called it's described as a serious nervous breakdown, and he potentially had to leave the Jesuits, but he was allowed to come back in. And it's a remarkable transformation to see somebody who had a nervous breakdown because of a fire 20 years later being this rock of courage and hope and strength on the battlefield amongst soldiers. So it's a tremendous story of transformation, and it's really based upon his faith, his prayer, his interior life, and also, as you say, he mentioned several times in his letters his guardian angel. Mm-hmm. There was one famous occasion when he was going to a convent away from the front line to say mass for some nuns early in the morning, and he said he heard a voice in his ear saying, "Take your gas helmet." He wasn't going to take it, so he went back and took it, and on his way to the convent there was a serious shelling attack with gas shells, and he was almost killed on that occasion, and he would have been killed if he hadn't come back and gotten his gas helmet.
That's one of the other things too about World War I. Both Pope St. Pius X, who warned against it, and he was pleading with the European leaders not to go to war because they were sort of stumbling into this war over one series of events after another. And it wasn't a sudden flare-up, it was just a stumbling. And then he died, and Pope Benedict XV came along and did the same. They were especially concerned about the modern weapons, like the machine gun that could do mass killing, and gas. Gas attacks, which are now against the rules of law. I think for war, I think the last one to use gas were the government of Syria against their citizens, and Saddam Hussein against his citizens, and I think against the Iranians. But it's been otherwise pretty much banished because it's such a horrible, mass destructive weapon. And he is out there focusing not on the danger, but except for the danger that might be for the souls that could be lost.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you mentioned the technology of the war. I mean, even today there's what's called the iron harvest, where there are shells that have lain in the ground for 100 years, are regularly discovered by farmers in the area, and even to this day farmers are killed by unexploded shells that have been left in the ground. From 100 years ago. They estimate that up to 1 billion shells were fired around that area of northern France and Belgium. And Father Doyle describes, literally curtains of shells, 50, 60 a minute falling just in the area he was in. And that's the type of courage that Father Doyle and other chaplains had, but he was particularly renowned for his courage to get out of the trench where they're relatively safe and to go across no man's land to rescue a wounded soldier in the face of that type of barrage of shells is an incredible testimony to the faith and also to the zeal of priests. He describes on one occasion the danger of running along the trench late at night to get to a wounded soldier, but he says, what priest would ever hesitate, no matter what the danger, when there's a soul at risk?
And again, want our audience to get a picture of what this would have been like. The part of the horror of the tactics with modern weapons is that both sides dug in these series of trenches. Nobody, after the initial months of the war, from, it started in about July, August, it started the fighting, and by the 1914, by January 1915, nobody moved again. They just stayed in these trenches, and in between trenches was what you called no man's land.
Yeah.
That's where people would send troops over, and they'd get shot dead.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where Father Willie went.
That's right.
To those guys.
And he lived
with more bullets coming at him from both sides.
And he lived in the trenches with the soldiers. Chaplain has the rank of a captain, so he could have availed of certain privileges, but generally he didn't. He stayed with the soldiers. He literally smelled of the sheep, to use that phrase, I suppose. But he went through all the sufferings with them. I mean, one of the if you've got men who are stationary in the trenches for a long time and you have dead bodies around, you're going to get vermin. And the rats were a terrible scourge.
Right. In the flies.
Rats everywhere, flies, fleas. He describes in his letters waking up at night in his dugout with rats crawling across him. He describes one slightly humorous incident where his sister-in-law sent a Christmas pudding. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Christmas puddings in the US, but they're a wonderful delicacy at Christmas.
We hear about it in English and Irish movies.
Yes, but Christmas pudding is greatly to be desired. So his sister-in-law sent one, and he put it aside in his dugout to come back to at Christmas, and he wrote in a letter, God forbid I should die before Christmas. I wouldn't want somebody else to get my pudding. I'm looking forward to having it. And he went to his pudding there on Christmas, and he found that the rats had eaten their way right into the centre of the pudding. But such as war, himself and the men still ate the rest of what was left of the pudding because our modern notions of hygiene and delicacy go out the window when you're living in those types of circumstances.
Yeah, it's and again to think there's flooding all the time during the rainy season.
Correct, yeah.
And snow. It's just
it's
miserable.
Incredible mud. Almost to some extent, almost you could drown in the mud in some circumstances. Freezing cold. He describes one occasion where he said Mass and the wine in the chalice froze and he had to stop Mass and get a candle to thaw out the wine so he could continue with Mass. So incredible sufferings.
Yeah, yeah. And again, staying focused. This is one of the things that I found very attractive in his book, is he stayed focused on God. He was focused on Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And the different ways he could bring people who desired God to know him when their government didn't care about God. You know, that focus was a laser light that just kept bringing them there.
And it was also a laser light for Father Doyle to be holy, and his own private, intimate diaries, which were never meant to be published, and they were found back in his room in Dublin after he died with a note saying, "Please destroy in case of my death." And his older brother was also a Jesuit, and he was cleaning out the room and discovered him. And he brought them to the superior and said, "I don't think we can destroy these." They showed a laser-like focus on Father Willie's personal sanctification and desire to be a saint. And he offered up, and you see it in his diaries again and again, and that's why he's a very relevant figure for today. He offered up all of those sufferings in the trenches in reparation for the sins of priests. And the very last thing he wrote in his private diary on the 10th anniversary of his ordination, and less than 3 weeks before he died, was that he offered up all those sufferings in the trenches for priests, for the sanctification of priests, and reparation for the sins of priests.
Which brings out a key element. To have that kind of laser focus on Jesus Christ, on the needs of the souls in the care of a priest. The priest has to avoid self-indulgence, has to seek holiness from Christ, has to let the Holy Spirit fashion him. And when we see the crisis going on, we talked about it before you came on, but we have a website dealing with it. But to deal with that focus, we priests have to seek holiness above everything else, or else we will give into a moral crisis of self-indulgence and loss of faith.
That's absolutely central to Father Willie. He denied himself very, very much, and his diaries reveal how much he denied himself even simple pleasures. He struggled with some asceticism or some penances, such as giving up bread on his butter, which for an Irishman is actually a bigger thing to do than it might sound like for other nations. But this absolute focus on sanctity, especially holiness for priests. He gave retreats for priests around Ireland, and he did a lot to recruit men to the priesthood. He wrote best-selling pamphlets on vocations and on the priesthood. And there's an untold number of men who became priests in the middle part of the 20th century because of that. And I once got a letter from an old retired priest in England who had been a soldier in the Second World War. And he said that his chaplain in the Second World War gave him one of Father Willie's booklets on the priesthood. And after having read it, he decided to be a priest. And some years later, he met the military chaplain and he said, "I want to thank you for giving me that booklet. I'm a priest because of it." And the chaplain said, "That's interesting, because I know at least 11 other soldiers to whom I gave that booklet who subsequently became priests because of it."
And that's one of the other elements that I think is important to see is as priests, our ability to have that close relationship with Jesus Christ is far more important than our other relationships. They'll come, but they'll come because of Christ, not because we're trying to be one of the guys.
Absolutely. And before Father Doyle went to the war, he was a very famous missionary priest in Ireland, going around preaching missions around Ireland and giving retreats. And he had tremendous success. There's a lot of testimony about how effective he was. Parish priests saying his mere presence in the parish changed it. He himself says that he never met a single person that he went after to bring back to confession who didn't come back. And his secret really was his life of prayer. And there's testimony from priests who were wondering, why is he so effective? What's going on? And they observed him during a mission. And they said he would get out of the confessional box at about 11 o'clock at night and go straight to the church and lie prostrate before the tabernacle until 2 or 3 in the morning. And he kept this practice of nocturnal prayer throughout all his life. We even have diary entries from his time in the war where he spent entire nights in prayer in his dugout in the trenches. When any of the rest of us would have been getting some well-earned rest, Father Willie was up praying all night long. And there was one occasion where he particularly did that for a Poor Clare convent that he founded in Ireland. So he has a connection with the Poor Clares.
Oh, where did he found the convent for the Poor Clares?
So he founded a convent of Poor Clare nuns in Cork City in Ireland. And there was an Irish Poor Clare nun to whom he was giving some spiritual direction. I think she was living in Belgium, but certainly abroad. And her father provided the money to found his convent. So Father Willie sorted out whatever ecclesiastical issues had to be sorted out, and also recruited other nuns from other convents to populate it. So that's the Poor Clare convent in Cork City, which is still there to this day. And he stayed in touch with them even when he was in the trenches. And on one occasion they had some difficulty, and he spent an entire night in prayer in very difficult circumstances just for them. And we know he did that on at least one occasion, but possibly on many others.
Well, that's something that's good for us, and we of course have our own Poor Clares, who Mother Angelica and the other sisters who are now up in Hansville and Cloister, are Poor Clares, and that's very important for us. So it was not only in the crisis of war, but his growth as a priest had begun before the war, because he was ordained, what about?
He was ordained in 1907.
Okay, so about 7 years before the war started. And already, because of that prayerfulness, was being very successful.
Absolutely. I mean, on the morning of his ordination, he also wrote in his diaries that his number one objective in life was to be holy. He didn't just want to be any priest, he wanted to be a holy priest. And he said, I want to go straight for sanctity. And really, the remaining 10 years of his life, he was only a priest for 10 years, those 10 years were living out that desire of his heart to be holy. And it's fascinating to read his private diaries about, I mean, he's a master spiritual tactician who had lots of different tactics to try and grow in holiness. He recorded the penances he did every day, his struggles, his successes, his failures. He didn't find it easy. He struggled like all of us do. And that's what's very reassuring from the example of Father Doyle, because very human, very, very fun-loving, very healthy, very normal person, who really put his heart and his soul into emptying himself so that God could fill him. So like St. John the Baptist, who says, I must decrease so that Christ can increase. That was really what Father Doyle did.
And you can tell, too, from listening to reading the stories, how much the soldiers loved him in response. They could see that. They loved him very, very much. We have to take a little bit of a break. We're going to come back in a couple of minutes. I want to get some of your questions and comments, as well as those of our studio audience, so please stay with us. All right, you ready for some questions?
Yes, looking forward to them.
All right, let's start off with a phone call. Hello, Marianne.
Hi, Father Pacwa. How are you?
Fine, fine. And what is your question?
Two brief questions for Mr. Kenny. I'm just curious how he became interested and involved in the life and heroism of Father Doyle. And also, I did a little bit of research tonight before the show, and I had read that Father Doyle, there had been a petition to move towards canonization in 1938 for Father Doyle, and apparently nothing has happened, and I'm just curious to know if perhaps there might be some date going forward when the petition may be made for the case of Father Doyle. And thank you so much. God bless you both. Take care.
All right, start off with how you got interested.
Okay, so actually it was a friend of mine who recommended that I read the original biography. So there was an original biography published in 1920 or 21 by Alfred O'Reilly, and that became a blockbuster book. It was translated into all the major European languages. It went through multiple editions, and it actually led to quite a significant level of devotion for Father Doyle. So a friend recommended that I read it. He thought I'd be interested in it, and I tracked down a copy. And I have to say I was astounded when I read it. I'm from a town that's about 2 miles away from where Father Doyle grew up and lived, so he was local to me. But I read a lot of biographies of saints because they're interesting. They're interesting history, they're interesting spiritual reading.
Ultimately, they're more interesting than the sinners.
But absolutely, yeah. I mean, people of great leadership, great character, and you can learn a bit from it. And the impression I had reading about Father Doyle was that here was a man who could stand in the company of some of the greatest saints in terms of his heroism, his love for Jesus, his work for souls. So that, I suppose, is how I got interested. Having read that biography, the thought came to me to set up a website about him, which I update every day with a quote from his writings or something he's doing, he did on that particular day as an anniversary. And from there it just grew. I started giving talks and doing interviews and doing work in the media. So that's how I got interested. I've met many people in a similar situation, even people who will not be the most ardent Catholics or people who've been a little alienated from the church. There's an authenticity there in the life of Father Doyle, and that's really what we need for evangelization, is authenticity. And there's not much more, you can't be much more authentic than literally to lay down your life for others, especially in the context of the crisis we see in the priesthood. So Father Doyle builds bridges, and many people even who aren't particularly Catholic are interested in him. So in terms of his of a canonization cause, there was a lot of interest originally back in the 20s and 30s, but in fact in the time when Father Doyle lived, there were 3 holy Jesuits, well, many holy Jesuits in Ireland, but 3 who stood out. There was Father Doyle himself, there was Father John Sullivan, who was ordained on the same day as Father Doyle, and there was Father Michael Brown, who was actually the novice master of both John Sullivan and Willie Doyle. And there was a kind of consultation with the Jesuits in Ireland, and there was a unanimous agreement that Father Sullivan's cause should proceed. And he was a famous convert. His father was the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. He was at the very highest echelon of Irish society. He was once known as the best dressed man in Dublin. He converted, became a Catholic, became a Jesuit priest, and was renowned for his humility, his holiness, his poverty, and also his healing charism. So that cause proceeded, and it's great that he was beatified last year, which is really great news. So in terms of Father Doyle, it was decided that we'll leave it to Providence and see what happens in the future. And perhaps at this particular moment in time, when there is skepticism about the church in Ireland, particularly about the priesthood, a priest who offered his life in reparation for the sins of priests, and a priest who is absolutely authentic, maybe that moment of providence has come.
Maybe good for the priests too, to know that he's interceding for them.
Yep.
Ma'am, where are you from?
Oh, San Antonio, Texas.
Welcome. And your
you.
question?
Thank you. Well, thank you. Actually, it's a 2-part. The first one is what kind of childhood did he have to become such a great person? And the second one is how many siblings did he have?
So Father Doyle was the youngest of 7 children. He was from a fairly well-to-do background. His father worked in the courts. His father retired at the age of 90 after a career spanning 73 years. So there was a very strong work ethic in that family. And being the youngest, I think he was doted on by the others. 4 of the 7 entered religious life. One of his brothers went to become a priest for the Dublin diocese, but he died 10 days before his ordination. A sister became a nun, and his next oldest brother was just ahead of him. He became a Jesuit, and I think that was key in recruiting Father Doyle. One of the things about his childhood is he had a great care for the local poor. He was very precocious in his charity. So if people are familiar with the example of Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, I often think there's a similarity between the young Father Doyle and Pier Giorgio. They both love sports, very sociable, very healthy, but a great concern for the poor. So Father Doyle would keep his pocket money. He would take food from the house, bring it to the poor. He would paint their houses. There was one occasion where there was an alcoholic who was dying. He didn't want to see a priest. Father Doyle spent 8 hours beside the man's bed, praying for him and urging him to see a priest. And finally he relented, and Willie ran off to get the local priest to come to him. So he had this evangelical zeal and care for others even as a youth. And he also got up early in the morning, did the work for the servants in the house, lit the fire for them, cleaned up the dishes. So not something you normally expect somebody from a wealthy background to do. And one fascinating story, to me at least, from that period of his childhood, the poor would come to visit the family to look for some money, some alms, especially at Christmas time. And it features in the EWTN docudrama. Himself and his brother would get the coins and they would polish them and shine them to make them sparkling and new, in order to add an extra dignity to the gift that they were giving to the poor. Not just any coin, but one that looked brand new.
Yeah.
And you might say, what difference does that make? It's a coin. But it's just a small, humble act to give an extra dignity to that gift.
See, that's the kind of respect for somebody in need that's just a good, solid element
Yes.
in his character, and that's a great thing. We have another question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
From Birmingham, Alabama.
Good to have you here. And what is your question?
I'm curious if there's evidence you could tell us about regarding a popular cult devoted to Father Doyle.
That's a great question. I'll start at the highest level and say there are several saints who are devoted to Father Doyle. So St. Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa, adopted some of his spiritual practices in her own spiritual life. St. Alberto Hurtado, a Jesuit from Chile, had a particular devotion to him. And also St. Jose Maria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, also read a Spanish translation of the original biography in Spanish in the 1930s, and also developed a devotion to him and wrote about him in some of his letters and own writings. But amongst ordinary people, there was a tremendous devotion. And Father Doyle died in 1917. By 1931, so just 14 years after he died, the Jesuits in Ireland had received 6,426 letters alleging favours through Father Doyle's intercession. From literally every corner of the world. There were almost 2,000 letters from the United States. There's letters from every single state in the US, and from every element of society. So there are letters from European nobility and royalty, and there's a letter from a 10-year-old Chinese peasant boy. So there was a huge amount of devotion to him right up into the 30s and 40s and 50s.
Yes, I'm surprised that I can see where they focused on the cause of Father Sullivan, but it's not all over yet. It's only 100 years.
There are some saints that, take centuries for their causes to get going, and, I do believe the time will come for Father Doyle, because his character is so human, so lovable, but also so holy, and his example is so powerful for anybody, whether you're a priest or a lay person, a soldier, whoever you are. I mean, his advice to people, and one of the things in the book is sections of advice that he gave in letters of spiritual direction. Anybody can follow it. Be generous, or do your work well today, or don't try and do big things. Try and do small things, and the smaller they are, the better. But do them with love. So I think he's a very universal character with a universal appeal.
And you can see how that would appeal to somebody like Mother Teresa, who took care of concrete little people, sometimes very small children.
That's right.
And other folks who are very poor, as well as to, Saint Escriva, Jose Maria Escriva, because he also sought to be excellent and holy in the daily things of life, and not in just grandeur ways, but in small things. Fit their personalities quite well.
Absolutely, and one of the things about Father Doyle is he did some very hard penance in his life. He felt he had a particular calling to that. He had approval from his confessors and from his superiors for that. But his advice to others was always, do your work well and do it with love, and do simple things.
Yeah. We have another caller. Hello, Major.
Yes,
Hi, where are you from?
Huntsville,
Huntsville, Alabama?
Alabama.
Well, just up the road from us. What's your question?
Well, it's a comment. I'm wondering if the gentleman there knows about the combat rosary. it was handed out to every member of the services in World War I. And it's made out of pull chain, very strong, and the members of the service wore it around their neck. It was to be worn. And the crucifix is a pardon crucifix. So it's a remarkable rosary. And there are some antiques still left. However, they've made new ones, replicas of it. And my wife and I both have one, and we really enjoy it.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much all I think I wanted to say. I was just thought that it's a comment that perhaps religiousness or something, whatever that word is, was greater in our great-grandparents.
Yeah. By the way, are you serving in the military now, or have you?
No, my first name is Major.
Okay, all right. I didn't know if I needed to salute or not. Well, okay, but that's a great point.
Yeah, well, I have one of those rosaries myself, and they're very well made and very sturdy. I think they were handed out more to the American soldiers than to the British soldiers, but I mean, obviously, the rosary was very important to Father Doyle. And I once received a letter from a gentleman who said that his grandfather had to go over the top out of the trench into no man's land. I think he was a teenager at the time, maybe only 18 years of age. And he was completely scared. And he found a shell hole, so when a shell explodes, it leaves a very big crater in the ground. And this teenager got in the shell hole and he wasn't coming out because he was afraid. And there were very serious penalties for a soldier who wouldn't go forward, who would be shot for it. So Father Doyle was walking along or doing his work, and he found this boy hiding in the shell hole. So he got into the shell hole with him, lay down with him and said, "What's wrong with you?" And he gave him courage. He said the rosary with him in the shell hole with bombs and shells and bullets flying around, and he gave him his rosary. And the soldier got out of the trenches, got out of the shell hole and fought and survived and kept that rosary all his life, Father Doyle's rosary that he was given in the shell hole. And I believe he was buried with that rosary when he died. But that family, like so many other families who were helped by Father Doyle, preserved that memory as a very precious memory of how Father Willie either saved a life or saved a soul.
Okay. We have another caller. Hello, Pat.
Yes, hello.
Hi, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Louisiana.
Great.
And I really love Patrick's blog on Father Doyle. It's wonderful. Patrick and Father Doyle are an inspiration. I wanted to ask, did Father Doyle have a particular devotion to a particular saint? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So
Okay.
to whom was Father Doyle devoted to?
It's a great question. Many saints. I mean, obviously the Jesuit saints, the great devotion to St. John Birchmans, the very humble Jesuit who didn't do anything extraordinary but did everything well.
And who also died by going out to help plague victims.
Correct, yes. He had a great devotion to St. John Marie Vianney because of his I suppose, patronage of priests. A particular devotion to St. Benedict Joseph Labre, which is an interesting one. So the beggar saint who died at the age of 33, who lived homeless on the streets of Rome. He had a fascination with him ever since he was a child. And he describes in his diary how St. Benedict Joseph grew up or lived near where Father Doyle was stationed in the war. So Father Doyle went to the old family home, which had become a museum, and he prayed in that house. And he felt called to look at something that was on the wall. And it was, I think the quote from St. Benedict Joseph Labre was something along the lines of, "I'm called to a hard life." And Father Doyle thought, that was particularly relevant for him as well. Many other saints, Carmelite saints, St. Teresa. St. Therese was born the same year as him. He visited her grave as well and felt particularly inspired by her as well. So great love of saints, also of the martyrs. And as a child, he read the lives of martyrs, and I think that really inspired him as a child.
Now, one of the things too about his death, given that this was a war where weapons that caused mass destruction were all over the place, whether it be machine guns, gas, and others. How exactly was it that he died?
So it was after a very difficult period of a number of weeks where another chaplain was meant to replace him who didn't show up for some reason. And Father Doyle got very, very little rest in those last 2 weeks. And there were some soldiers who were trapped out in no man's land. I believe they weren't actually Catholic soldiers, and they were wounded. And Father Doyle got out and went to help them. And sadly, he was hit by a shell, and they were all killed. His body was never recovered. There is a story that some soldiers noted where his body was, and the men were devastated when they heard that Father Doyle was killed. I mean, they thought he was impervious to death because he survived so many close scrapes. So they made a note of where his body was, and they went back out to retrieve it, and it was gone at that point, presumably hit by another shell. Yeah. So his body isn't with us anymore.
Mm-hmm. But it's in this war with sort of this mass destruction going on, his body was obliterated, but not he. You know, in Christ, he's still very much alive, and there's no place where you can see his body. But these memories, people seeking his intercession, all of that is still very much alive and lively.
And I would say getting more alive in a sense, because we have the docudrama, which is a tremendous testimony to him. It really tells the story very, very well. But a number of other books that have been published in the last few years. A very big biography of his time in the war by Carol Hope called Worshipper and Worshipped, a definitive biography of those war years. A children's book by Carmel Callig in Ireland, great little book for children. Catholic Truth Society in the UK has brought out a great booklet on him by K.V. Turley, and also this book by Ignatius Press. So I think there's more and more interest in the life of Father Doyle.
Well, we want to let people know the book is called To Raise the Fallen, a selection of the war letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of Father Willie Doyle. Now, Dr. Patrick Kennedy here was the editor of that, because there's a vast amount of material, and he brought down to some of these best of these things. And you can get that from EWTNRC.com, EWTNRC.com. And again, we're going to show the docudrama. It's called Bravery Under Fire, Father Willie Doyle, S.J. That'll be on Veterans Day, not the national holiday, but the actual day, Sunday, November 11th. It'll be at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. They'll have a DVD copy of it, also available at EWTNRC.com, and you can take a look at that and learn about this modern saint. Thank you very much for being with us, and may the Lord bless all of you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.